Many atheists depict Christians as stupid, ignorant, simple, or worse, evil. Just as Ultron first appears weak, mangled, and resembling a wooden Pinocchio on strings, that's exactly what some atheists want to caricature Christianity as, a hollow man. For it is easier to take down a figment of your imagination, a man made of straw,
How about a little fire, Scarecrow?
than it is to take down a real man made of bone, brawn, and brains. They come out of the woodwork to attack theists, and often gang up against you in the comments section. It didn't used to be this way. Stick around and I'll show you the origins of this new volatility and aggression towards Christians. You will learn that these new atheists aren't playing fair. They misrepresent what Christians believe to ridicule, challenge, and win the debate. But I want you to know what it is they are up to, so you don't fall prey to their tactics.
Sometimes when one person is arguing against another, or when they're having an argument in their head, they make their opponent into a straw man, which is basically they take their opponent and caricature their perspective and try to make it as weak as possible and laugh about it, and then they come up with their argument and destroy the straw man and feel that they've obtained victory. But it's a very pathetic way of thinking. It's not thinking at all.
While not every atheist following these tactics, most are. And it's a result of a movement in 2007 when Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennet, the self-proclaimed four Horsemen of Atheism, got together to film their discussion about religion, Christianity, and secularism. That video went viral, and following its meteoric rise, several books were written by these lying, dog-faced
phony soldiers.
Did you know there are much better thinkers who contributed to the understanding of atheism than the Four Horsemen? David Hume, Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Ayn Rand, Antony Flew, Jordan Howard Sobel, J.L. Mackie, Michael Martin, my favorite because he seems to really wrestle with the arguments of theism more than the others, and Graham Oppy, to name a few. But these four horsemen have influenced the masses of new atheists in a host of ways that the contributors on this short list would never have directed. They are powerful rhetorically, but lacking in substance and even familiarity with theistic arguments Christians have heralded for thousands of years, which is what leads them to strawman the Christian. In this video, I'm going to show you some of the more common strawmen these gents set up, because it's likely you've heard someone parrot them who claims your sky daddy is imaginary.
There is no God.
Follow along as we take a peek behind the curtain to get anemic Ultron to Ultron Prime. Yes, Ultron's the bad guy. I'm depicting Ultron as the Christian, but without God, goodness is entirely subjective and meaningless. A conclusion Dawkins arrives at near the end of this video. Firstly, the four horsemen excoriate Christians for being ignorant, dumb, simple, for having no reason, no evidence, no justification for their religious beliefs. But then, don't look at the chief arguments for God's existence put forth by some of the most influential thinkers of history. These apocalyptic harbingers commit the logical fallacy of suppressing the evidence that would go in favor of theism. This is their first mistake in building their house of cards. Sam Harris, in his book The End of Faith, writes, "A glance at history or at the pages of any newspaper reveals that ideas which divide one group of human beings from another, only to unite them in slaughter, generally have their roots in religion. Religious faith represents so uncompromising a misuse of the power of our minds that it forms a kind of perverse cultural singularity, a vanishing point beyond which rational discourse proves impossible." Harris points the tip of his sword at Christians and religions in general for warmongering and being the impetus for slaughter, when the closest thing we have to an atheist worldview, Marxism, has resulted in more deaths and atrocities than any other ideology or religion that ever existed. 100 million deaths have been the result of communist regimes through executions, man-made hunger, famine, war, deportations, torture, forced labor, and even slavery. Harris holds that rational discourse proves impossible with the religious, even though he fails to seriously engage the actual arguments and evidence that Christians put forth for their belief. These new atheists, new from 2007, were deemed new because they had a completely different approach than the atheists who came before them. They wouldn't engage with the best arguments. How do they get around that, you ask? For one, they changed the goalpost from philosophy to natural sciences. This is their first important stop on the way to defeat Ultra. The philosophical arguments in favor of Christianity are sound, valid, logical, and powerful. I think they know that. So they attempted to rewrite the rules of engagement by excluding the realm of knowledge that does in fact prove if there is or isn't a God. Philosophy and metaphysics, that is reality and existence. Limiting their approach to only what can be tested with the five senses, the four horsemen threw out the evidence that would lead them to the conclusion that God exists. This is known as the fallacy of begging the question, or circular reasoning. Their criteria for knowledge involves self-contradictory belief that everything should be scientifically proven through the five senses. However, they can't prove this method using their own standard because you can't scientifically test arguments. They rely on immaterial concepts like logic, philosophy, and morality, but don't justify these using the five senses. They ask for physical evidence. God is non-physical, yet they don't validate their own arguments by their own standard. Additionally, the four horsemen's arguments often rely more on emotion than intellect. If you understand the foundation of these new atheists, you'll be able to see how they strawman the Christian. Here's Richard Dawkins.
What I don't think is that it helps to invoke supernatural explanations. If our current scientific explanations aren't adequate to do the job, then we need better ones. We need to work more. And of course, the history of science shows just that as science goes on, problems get solved one after another, and the science advances as science gets better. But to invoke a non-scientific, non-physical explanation is simply to lie down in a cowardly way and say, we can't solve it, so we're going to invoke magic.
Dawkins is saying that people of religion look at the world and begin asking questions about existence, purpose, how we got here. And since these people have no clue, they kick for the goalposts and posit it must be God. This is called the God of the Gaps argument. Here's how it works. The theist doesn't know how or why something is, so they import God as the answer. The problem with this belief is Christians don't believe it. We don't look at the world without understanding and in defeat shrug our shoulders and say, God must have done it. It's as if he thinks we made up some divine being to answer difficult questions of life. He's basically saying they are too lazy, so they put their trust in the imaginary and don't worry about the reality that they don't know scientifically. The reasons we believe in God is because he must exist by necessity. Christianity is true because it lines up with, it corresponds with reality. Christianity best aligns with the furniture we have, the furniture that we find in existence, from the material world to the spiritual. A painting has a painter. I could go on, but that's not the subject of this video. In this clip, Dawkins is expressing a belief, a faith as well, that science will solve the problems eventually. Do you see what Dawkins is doing? The very thing he says Christians are guilty of, he is simply lying down in a cowardly way and saying, we're going to invoke science. Christians don't arrive at the God of the Gaps as an explanation for the world as we see it. Instead, we infer the best possible explanation. Most arguments for God's existence don't insert God into natural processes. Arguments for God's existence, explanations for him being real, are philosophical, and they must be because he is not physical. Science is the realm of the physical, but it only describes what is. Philosophy is the realm of what ought to be. Christians use scientific data, information, and infer philosophical theories that best fit the data. Christians don't argue from gaps in our knowledge to magically explain God did it. We take the scientific data as well as philosophical realities to infer and conclude that God does exist. Instead of offering a better explanation for the data, Dawkins puts his faith in a magical, superhuman, unknown future scientist to fill the gap. Instead of falsely accusing us of the God of the Gaps, Dawkins actually commits a science of the gaps fallacy. which takes more faith than trust in the God of the Bible.
9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Okay, picture an Asian tsunami of the sort we saw in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. One of those every 10 days, killing children only under 5. Okay, it's 24,000 children a day, 1,000 an hour, 17 or so a minute. That means before I can get to the end of this sentence, some few children, very likely, will have died in terror and agony. Okay, think of the parents of these children. Think of the fact that most of these men and women believe in God and are praying at this moment for their children to be spared. And their prayers will not be answered. Any God who would allow children by the millions to suffer and die in this way, and their parents to grieve in this way, either can do nothing to help them or doesn't care to. He is therefore either impotent or evil.
Because innocent children suffered and died, God is either impotent or evil. Is this new information? Have Christians never considered this moral charge against God? Do Christians believe God is either impotent or evil? This is what I mean when I say the four horsemen aren't aware of the classical arguments, or worse, they are aware, but suppress the evidence for God's existence and how Christians throughout the ages have answered these objections. They popularize old objections that have been solved. So convinced that Christians are impossible to have rational discourse with, Harris doesn't take the counter-arguments and refutations seriously, hoping instead that his audience isn't aware of them, and as a substitute will be swayed by his disbelief, his ridicule, and mockery of supposed Christian beliefs. Harris is using an old argument called the problem of evil. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus thought that natural evil challenges our belief in God. He reasoned, if God knows about our suffering, since he's all-knowing, he cares about our suffering because he's all-loving, and can do something about our suffering because he's all-powerful, then there shouldn't be any suffering. Christians do hold that God knows about our suffering, that he does care about our suffering, and that he is, in fact, powerful enough to do something about it. But it doesn't follow that we shouldn't suffer. Christians understand suffering as accomplishing something that would otherwise be impossible. Character formation, resisting sin. We even have an explanation for suffering: sin and disobedience to God. Because sin entered the world, death followed. Christians don't hold that there should be no suffering. No, our scriptures give a very different aspect than Harris is arguing for. Acts chapter 5, verse 41. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Romans chapter 5, verse 3. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Hebrews 10:34. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 13. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Though Harris challenges the morality of God, he does so from a position of sentiment. We, the audience, are moved by emotion and a sense of justice over the atrocities that have occurred. But does it follow that because suffering exists, God does not? No, it doesn't. And Harris hasn't shown his work on the matter to get us there. Suffering occurs. Terrible and atrocious, unwarranted things. Hurts exist. How does it follow that God does not exist? He could exist and have a very good reason for allowing evil to occur. There's the free will defense, the fact that evil became possible because free will exists. For some reason, God values our free will, making evil possible, then not. The fact that this world is not all there is, and our time here is preparing us for eternal life. Suffering, even death, can serve to make us heaven ready. Harris, being concerned most with moral values, doesn't engage seriously with any of the major contributors to the moral landscape or theodicies that have been written in response to his old objections. Nowhere does Harris address Augustine, Aquinas, Leibniz, John Hick, or even the contemporary works of Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, C.S. Lewis, Os Guinness, Eleanor Stump, N.T. Wright, Paul Copan, or John Feinberg. Was Harris aware of the tomes available to really represent the arguments of Christians with regards to morality and theodicy, or not? He's a smart guy, a neuroscientist who is writing a book on morality. You think he would do his research. It's conceivable that he was keen on these contributors. He does level a charge against both Augustine and Aquinas in his letter to a Christian nation, but does nothing to engage with their robust arguments in explaining God allowing evil to exist. Harris set his sights on manipulating the populace, not on representing Christianity truly, honestly, and as such has committed the logical fallacy of the straw man. On the second to last page in his book, The Moral Landscape, Dr. Harris makes the telling admission that if people like rapists, liars, and thieves could be just as happy as good people, then his moral landscape would no longer be a moral landscape. Rather, it would just be a continuum of well-being whose peaks are occupied by good and bad people, or evil people alike. He begins by arguing for human and animal flourishing as the highest moral goods, but is aware that if it can be demonstrated and tested that someone could experience the degree of satisfaction and happiness as good people by doing evil, then we are right back to what science will always offer us. That which is, and not an evaluative what should be. As his counterpart Dawkins states, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. This is truly taking his naturalism, his atheism, and scientific worldview to its logical conclusion. No evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. The problem with his moment of clairvoyance is, of course, that he speaks, writes, and does everything in his power to persuade us otherwise. That it really does matter what we believe, what we do, and how we arrive at conclusions. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spent the time to tell us. If I believed about God what the four horsemen do, I'd be an atheist too. Fortunately, they misrepresent God, his people, and must steal from our cupboard to make their case against God. If this video interested you, look for our upcoming video on how Sam Harris strawman Jesus and revealed a more sinister tactic that virtually allows him to falsify, lie, and mislead his audience to accomplish his goals. See you in the next one.